August 15, 1943. 9:40 hours. Norfolk Naval Station, Virginia. Private Giuseppe Marino of the Italian Army stood on the deck of the transport ship, watching the Virginia coastline approach, his hands gripping the rail so tightly his knuckles were white. He'd been captured in Tunisia 3 months earlier when Italian forces collapsed under Allied assault. He'd spent weeks in North African POW camps before being loaded onto this ship with 800 other Italian prisoners for transport to America. During the Atlantic crossing, he'd had plenty of time to imagine what awaited him. Harsh labor camps, minimal food, guards who'd treat Italian prisoners with the cruelty that enemy captives deserved. The ship docked, and American MPs began organizing the prisoners for disembarkation. Marino shuffled down the gangway with the others, trying to look alert despite exhaustion from the voyage. An American sergeant with a clipboard was checking off prisoners as they filed past, and when Marino reached him, the sergeant looked at his identification tag and smiled. "Marino," the sergeant said. "Hey, my name's Marino too. Staff Sergeant Anthony Marino, 3rd generation from Palermo. Where's your family from?" Marino stared at the American sergeant, at his U.S. Army uniform, at his face that could have belonged to any of Marino's cousins back in Sicily, at the name Marino stenciled on his uniform. For a moment, he couldn't process what was happening. This American soldier who was guarding Italian prisoners, who represented the enemy that had defeated Italy's forces, this man was also Marino, probably from the same region, possibly even distantly related. "Palermo," Marino finally managed in broken English. "My family, also Palermo." Sergeant Marino grinned and said something in rapid Sicilian dialect that made several nearby prisoners laugh despite their circumstances. Then he switched back to English. "Welcome to America, Paisa. You're going to be fine here. We take care of our own, even when they're on the wrong side." For Giuseppe Marino and approximately 51,000 other Italian POWs who would be held in more than 600 camps across America during the war, that first encounter with Italian-American guards, workers, and civilians created cognitive dissonance that challenged everything they'd expected about captivity and about the nation they'd been fighting against. The unexpected destination. The decision to transport Italian POWs to America, rather than holding them in North Africa or Britain, was driven by practical logistics rather than humanitarian considerations. The massive number of prisoners captured in Tunisia, over 275,000 Italian and German soldiers surrendered in May 1943, overwhelmed local detention capacity. Britain couldn't house them without diverting resources from war effort. North Africa lacked infrastructure to support large POW populations. America had space, resources, and agricultural labor shortages that POWs could help address. The scale of Italian POW transport to America was substantial. Between June 1943 and September 1943, approximately 51,000 Italian military personnel were shipped across the Atlantic to camps established throughout the American interior. They joined approximately 5,000 Italian civilians who'd been interned at war's start and were being held in detention facilities separate from military POWs. The military prisoners ranged from teenagers conscripted just before capture to career soldiers who'd fought in North Africa, Sicily, and other theaters. The expectations Italian POWs carried to America were shaped by propaganda about American brutality and by their own military's treatment of prisoners. Italian forces in North Africa had treated British and Allied prisoners harshly. Inadequate food, minimal medical care, forced labor in dangerous conditions. The Italian prisoners assumed they'd receive similar or worse treatment from Americans. The propaganda had emphasized American cultural inferiority and suggested that democratic societies produced weak, undisciplined soldiers who'd treat prisoners badly out of incompetence rather than deliberate cruelty. The camp system. The POW camps established across America for Italian prisoners ranged from large installations holding thousands to small branch camps attached to farms or work projects holding dozens. The camps were distributed across 45 states, though concentrated heavily in agricultural regions where labor shortages made prisoner work valuable. The living conditions in American POW camps were governed by Geneva Convention requirements and by American military efficiency that ensured adequate food, housing, and medical care. The typical camp provided barracks housing, 3 meals daily meeting minimum 2,900 calorie requirements, medical facilities staffed by American and prisoner medical personnel, recreational facilities, and opportunities for work that provided small wages. The conditions exceeded what many Italian soldiers had experienced in their own military service and far exceeded what they'd expected from captivity. The food was particularly striking to Italian POWs who'd been on reduced rations during North Africa campaigns. American military rations provided abundant food by Italian military standards: meat, bread, vegetables, coffee, desserts. The meals weren't Italian cuisine, but they were adequate and sometimes generous. Many POWs gained weight during captivity, recovering from malnutrition experienced during combat and after capture. Corporal Antonio Romano, captured in Tunisia and held at a camp in Texas, described the food situation in a letter to his family. "We eat 3 times every day. The food is American, strange to our taste sometimes, but there is always enough. Meat almost daily. Fresh bread, coffee, and sugar. I have gained 15 pounds since arriving here. The guards joke that we eat better than Italian soldiers did in the field, and it is true. I am healthier as prisoner in America than I was as soldier fighting in Africa." The work programs. The Geneva Convention allowed prisoners to be employed in non-military work, and American authorities quickly organized work programs that addressed agricultural labor shortages while providing prisoners with activity and small wages. The work assignments varied widely: harvesting crops, logging, food processing, construction, maintenance, and various agricultural tasks. The work brought Italian POWs into direct contact with American civilians, particularly farmers and agricultural workers. These encounters often revealed shared Italian heritage as prisoners worked alongside Italian-American farmers, or in communities with significant Italian-American populations. The cultural connections that emerged complicated the prisoner-captor dynamic and created relationships that neither side had anticipated. The work conditions were generally reasonable by both Geneva Convention standards and by comparison to what Italian POWs had experienced in military service. Hours were limited, safety standards were maintained, and prisoners received small wages, typically 80 cents daily in scrip that could be used at camp canteens. The work was often agricultural labor familiar to many prisoners from rural Italian backgrounds. The supervision was typically professional rather than harsh. The Italian-American complexity. For Italian-American guards and civilians interacting with Italian POWs, the situation created complex emotional responses. They were Americans serving American interests, but they were also people with cultural and often family connections to Italy, who found themselves managing prisoners from their ancestral homeland. The dual identity created tensions that varied depending on individual circumstances and attitudes. Some Italian Americans maintained strict professional distance from POWs, emphasizing their American identity and treating prisoners as enemies regardless of shared heritage. Others found themselves drawn to prisoners who reminded them of family members, who spoke dialects their grandparents had spoken, who came from towns and regions they'd heard about throughout their childhoods. The range of responses reflected broader Italian-American community tensions between maintaining ethnic identity and demonstrating American loyalty. The Italian-American community faced particular pressures during the war. Italy was enemy nation, and Italian-Americans were sometimes viewed with suspicion despite their American citizenship and their service in American military. The community responded by emphasizing American patriotism, by serving in disproportionate numbers in military, and by carefully navigating the complexity of having cultural connections to enemy nation while being thoroughly American in loyalty and identity. Staff Sergeant Vincent Russo, who supervised Italian POWs at a California camp, described his conflicted feelings. "My parents came from Naples. I grew up speaking Italian at home. When Italy declared war, it felt personal, like family had betrayed us. But then I'm assigned to guard Italian prisoners, and they're just guys like my cousins, speaking the same dialect my grandmother spoke. I had to separate my job from my heritage. I treated them fairly as prisoners, but I made sure they understood I was American first. Still, I'd catch myself helping them more than I should have. Explaining things in Italian when I could have made them struggle with English, looking the other way when they bent minor rules. The connection was there, whether I wanted it or not. The first encounters. The initial encounters between Italian POWs and their American guards and handlers consistently produced surprise and confusion, as prisoners discovered that many of the Americans wore Italian names, spoke Italian dialects, and had family connections to the same regions of Italy the prisoners came from. The statistics of Italian-American population explained the pattern. By 1940, approximately 4.6 million Americans identified as Italian or of Italian descent, roughly 3.5% of total U.S. population. They were concentrated heavily in northeastern and midwestern states, where many POW camps would be established. In cities like New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Chicago, and San Francisco, Italian Americans comprised significant percentages of local populations. Many had parents or grandparents who'd immigrated from Italy, spoke Italian at home, maintained cultural connections to Italian regions, and identified strongly with Italian heritage even while being thoroughly American. The military service patterns of Italian Americans added another layer of complexity. Approximately 500,000 Italian Americans served in U.S. military during World War II, about 10% of Italian American population, roughly proportional to overall American military service rates. They served in all branches and theaters, including as guards and administrators in POW camps holding Italian prisoners. The situation created awkward encounters, where American soldiers with Italian names guarded, fed, and managed prisoners from the nation their parents or grandparents had left decades earlier. Private Giuseppe Marino's experience at Norfolk was replicated across hundreds of camps as Italian POWs encountered Italian-American guards, camp workers, and local civilians. The encounters typically followed similar patterns: initial confusion, recognition of shared names or regional origins, awkward conversations mixing English and Italian, and gradual development of relationships that transcended the formal prisoner-guard dynamic. The cultural exchange. Despite the formal prisoner-guard relationship, cultural exchanges developed between Italian POWs and American communities, particularly in areas with significant Italian-American populations. The exchanges ranged from simple conversation to shared meals to collaborative work on projects that benefited both prisoners and locals. The exchanges often centered on food and traditional practices. Italian POWs would teach American guards or local civilians how to prepare traditional Italian dishes using available ingredients. Italian-American families would bring food to camps: fresh bread, pasta, traditional dishes that reminded prisoners of home. The culinary connections created bonds that transcended the wartime enmity. The Catholic Church played a significant role in facilitating cultural exchange. Many Italian POWs were Catholic, and American Catholic parishes, often with Italian-American congregations, organized services, social events, and assistance programs for prisoners. The religious connections created additional bridges between prisoners and communities. Private Giuseppe Marino, working on a farm near Rochester, New York, encountered an Italian-American family who invited him to Sunday dinner after church, an arrangement that technically violated regulations but was tolerated by authorities who recognized the humanitarian value. "They treated me like family," Marino wrote to his mother. The grandmother spoke Sicilian dialect like home. They served pasta and wine and told stories about their village in Sicily. For a few hours, I forgot I was prisoner. They asked about current conditions in Sicily. I told them what I knew. They told me about America, about how they'd built good life here. It made me understand why they fought for America, even though Italy was their homeland. They'd become Americans without forgetting they were Italian. The propaganda value. American authorities recognized the propaganda value of treating Italian POWs well and facilitating positive interactions with Italian-American communities. The goal was encouraging Italian prisoners to view America favorably and to spread positive reports about American conduct that might influence Italian public opinion and military morale. The approach was remarkably successful. Italian POWs consistently wrote letters home describing their treatment in terms that contradicted Axis propaganda about American brutality. The letters emphasized abundant food, decent living conditions, fair treatment, and often mentioned encounters with Italian Americans who'd shared names, regional origins, and cultural connections. The propaganda effect was amplified when Italy signed armistice with Allies in September 1943 and switched sides to fight against Germany. Italian POWs in America were offered opportunity to volunteer for service with Allied forces, and approximately 35,000–40,000 accepted, roughly 70–80% of military-age Italian POWs. The high volunteer rate reflected both their treatment during captivity and their willingness to fight against Germany once Italy formally changed allegiances. The paradox of captivity. For many Italian POWs, captivity in America created paradoxical situation where imprisonment meant better living conditions, more food, and greater security than they'd experienced as soldiers in Italian military service. The paradox challenged their understanding of victory, defeat, and what constituted hardship. The conditions prompted reflection and sometimes bitter recognition of how poorly Italian military had treated its own soldiers. Adequate food, decent housing, medical care, and fair treatment. These basics that American captivity provided highlighted by contrast how inadequate Italian military logistics and leadership had been. Many prisoners concluded that they'd been sacrificed by incompetent government and military leadership that had sent them to fight without adequate preparation, supply, or support. Corporal Antonio Romano articulated the paradox in a letter. "I am prisoner, but I live better than I did as soldier. I am defeated, but I am healthier and better fed. The Americans treat Italian prisoners better than Italian officers treated Italian soldiers. This makes me angry at my own country's leadership, not at the Americans who captured me. They defeated us, but they are not cruel. Our own leaders sent us to die, and didn't care if we had food or equipment or medical care. Who is the real enemy?" The friendships that formed. Despite regulations discouraging fraternization between prisoners and guards or civilians, friendships formed between Italian POWs and Americans, particularly Italian Americans, that would sometimes last beyond the war. The connections were built on shared cultural heritage, common humanity, and simple human kindness that transcended wartime roles. The friendships were particularly strong between prisoners and Italian-American guards or civilians who'd worked closely with them. The shared language, cultural references, and often regional connections created bonds that felt more like extended family than enemy relationships. After the war, some Italian POWs would maintain correspondence with American friends they'd made during captivity, and a few would eventually immigrate to America partly because of connections formed during imprisonment. Staff Sergeant Vincent Russo maintained correspondence with several former POWs after the war. "I'd guarded these guys for 2 years. Some of them I'd talked with almost daily. We'd discovered our families came from neighboring villages in Italy. After the war, it felt natural to stay in touch. I visited one in Naples when I went to Italy in 1950. He showed me around, introduced me to his family. We talked about the war and about how strange it had been that we'd met as guard and prisoner. The connection we'd formed during the war survived it." The repatriation. The repatriation of Italian POWs began in 1945 after Germany's defeat, continuing through 1946 as shipping became available and Italy's post-war situation stabilized enough to receive returning prisoners. For many prisoners, repatriation was bittersweet. They wanted to return home and reunite with families, but they were leaving country where they'd been treated well, and sometimes developed genuine friendships. The departing prisoners carried memories that would shape their post-war attitudes toward America, and sometimes influence their life decisions. Many would tell families and friends about their treatment in American captivity, describing experiences that contradicted everything they'd been taught about America before capture. Some would eventually immigrate to America, drawn by opportunities and by positive memory. Actually were distant relatives, second or third cousins whose family lines had diverged when one branch immigrated to America decades earlier. For the Italian POWs, the encounters with Italian Americans challenged their understanding of what America meant. They'd expected foreign enemy who'd be incomprehensible and hostile. Instead, they'd found people who looked like them, who spoke their language or their grandparents' dialects, who understood their culture, who bore their names. The discovery that millions of people with Italian heritage had built successful lives in America while maintaining cultural identity suggested possibilities that many prisoners hadn't imagined. For Giuseppe Marino, working on farms in upstate New York and encountering Italian-American families who'd emigrated from the same Sicilian villages his family still lived in, the experience was transformative. "They asked me to stay," he wrote to his family in 1946, as repatriation approached. "They said I could work here, that opportunities exist that don't exist in Sicily anymore. They showed me how Italians could be successful in America without forgetting where they came from. I told them I must return home first, but perhaps someday I will come back. America is not the enemy I thought it was. America is a place where people like us can build good lives." The story of Italian POWs in America who couldn't believe so many Americans had Italian last names documented more than curious coincidence or amusing cultural connection. It documented how shared heritage could transcend wartime enmity, how cultural bridges could exist even between enemies, and how the accident of immigration patterns had created a situation where prisoners discovered that the nation they'd been fighting against included millions of people who shared their names, their culture, and of their time as prisoners. The repatriation also affected American guards and civilians who'd worked with prisoners. For Italian Americans particularly, the departure of prisoners they'd befriended created sense of loss. The connections had been complicated by circumstances, but had been real nonetheless. The names that connected. The moment when Giuseppe Marino encountered Sergeant Anthony Marino at Norfolk Dock was replicated thousands of times across hundreds of camps, as Italian POWs discovered that their guards, supervisors, doctors, chaplains, and neighbors bore the same surnames: Marino, Romano, Russo, Caruso, DiMaggio, Lombardi. The shared names represented shared heritage that complicated enemy relationships and created bridges between recent adversaries. The names carried meanings beyond simple identification. They represented family histories, regional origins, cultural traditions, and connections that transcended the temporary circumstance of war. When an Italian prisoner named Romano met an American guard named Romano, the surname created immediate connection that suggested they might be distant relatives, that their families might have come from the same villages, that they shared heritage despite being on opposite sides of the war. The connections built on shared names often expanded into genuine relationships. Prisoners and guards would discover they had family connections to same regions of Italy. They'd share stories about traditions, foods, festivals. They'd sometimes discover their heritage, and who'd built successful lives while maintaining the traditions that prisoners still valued. The names on the dog tags and prisoner rosters, Marino and Marino, Romano and Romano, Russo and Russo, represented connection that survived war, that complicated enemy relationships, and that ultimately contributed to building post-war cooperation between nations that had been adversaries just years before. The Italian POWs who returned home carried memories not just of decent treatment, but of discovering cousins they hadn't known they had, wearing American uniforms and speaking in dialects their grandmothers would have recognized.